So I want to circle back to something related to religion that I wanted to get to earlier, but we're doing a lot here. Do you think there's any difference, or do you both think there's any difference? Ben's Jewish and your belief is Christian, comes from the Christian tradition.
Yeah.
Does that matter at all? Whatever differences there are in that little place where you're both saying, we see the reasons why our morals and ethics and all that come from this. We're also acknowledging, the real world and biology and all of those things. Whatever differences you may have, which I don't even know that any of the three of us know what those differences are, do they even matter?
They might. That would be a lovely
I'd love to figure out if there are.
Yeah, I mean, it depends. For me, it depends on the brand of religion that a person is espousing. So,
so let's just do this with
sure.
you two.
So my feeling, I'm writing a book on this right now, actually. There are certain principles that obviously undergird Christianity that are from the Judaic tradition. I mean, that clearly the first
it's like a manifestation of the prophetic tradition.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, it's essentially an attempt to merge Jerusalem with Athens is I think the book of John is the most obvious example, using the logos as sort of the unifying feature, and writing the whole thing in Greek, right? I mean, that was not the lingua franca of the time. That was not what people were speaking, except in educated circles. So all the Judaic principles, things like a God involved in history, a God who cares about individuals, the notion that you have a choice between good and evil, so choose good, and so that you will live long on the earth, right? All these things were taken forward into Christianity. The major distinctions in terms of Christianity versus Judaism are the idea that, and again, it depends on your interpretation of Christianity. Early Christianity sort of suggested that history had ended with Christ, and then in later kind of iterations of Christianity, that was moved beyond, right? It wasn't that history had ended, it was that Christ would come back when history had reached its logical progression. The progression of history didn't end, but original messianism was, this is the Messiah, we're done, right? History's over. It was a millennialist religion.
Right, that's what very few people think that now.
That's right. So, so this is why I'm trying to distinguish, brands of Christianity, because obviously there's serious differences, even in basic root level, between Catholicism and Calvinism and Lutheranism, and all these things have different iterations. So, my very strong belief in free will and my actual building of a moral system, and Judaism is building a moral system on the notion of free will, obviously runs directly counter to, for example, Calvinism. Right? Calvinism suggests that free will is chimerical and there's no basis for it, and that God grants you grace based on what he wants to do. So it depends on the brand of Christianity, but I think that overall the conflict between Christianity and Judaism in large measure is, especially in the early conflict, was political rather than ideological in a lot of ways. It was a new religion attempting to establish its own footing, and was angry that Jews would not join this new religion and leave behind tradition. I think that there are certain ways in which Christianity, like for example, the main distinction between Christianity and Judaism that people usually make is that Christianity is a grace-based religion and Judaism is an acts-based religion, meaning that Judaism says you sort of earn your way into heaven, right? You earn your way toward a better life. And Christianity says if you believe, right, I'm the way, the truth, and the life. If you believe, then you're good. But the truth is that Christianity sort of backdoors the Judaic view by saying, if you really do believe, then you're going to act in these particular ways that demonstrate your belief.
Yeah, well,
right?
There's this weird paradoxical relationship between the idea of belief in Christianity, the belief that Christ came to save everyone from their sins, and that all you have to do is admit that and you're redeemed. Like, there's symbolic truth to that would take a long time to unpack. But there's also an injunction that goes along with that to imitate Christ in your life.
Exactly.
Right? So it's like,
I feel like a lot of these distinctions are almost, some of them are almost a little false. I mean, meaning that they're either Christian misreads of Judaism or Jewish misreads of Christianity. And that when you get to the root of it, I mean, this is what Maimonides says, that there are significant differences between Judaism and Christianity, but his view of Christianity from a Jewish historical point of view is that Judaism was never bound to convert billions of people around the world, but Christianity was, specifically because we have a lot of crap we got to do. I mean, Jews have, we have 613 commandments. Yeah. We have to keep kosher. We have to do all of these things.
I appreciate you doing a lot of them for me.
Yeah, no problem. I'm taking care of it. Yeah, I'll transfer over the points in the afterlife.
I assume someone's
I'll give you one of my afterlives. Yeah, exactly. Yeah. But I think that Christianity ends up doing a lot of those same things that, there were supposed to be stark distinctions, just under a different guise. So when it comes to, this is why in the modern world, when the discrimination between, from Christians toward Jews largely has ended, I think that what you're seeing is this tremendous confluence between particularly Orthodox Jews and observant Christians on matters of values. Because once Christianity in the late 20th century, in the mid 20th century, and in America more broadly with Christianity, because American Christianity is very different than European Christianity. Once there was an idea that Jews were not the enemy to be converted, but maybe you still want to convert me, but we're not going to come at you with a knife, we're going to come at you with a book.
Yeah.
And that we share a common framework for how the world is supposed to work. You just may not agree with the second half of the book, right? And then I think that's created a pretty good working relationship with. This is why I'm struggling to come up with what are the significant differences. And so I need a Christian to tell me what is the significant difference, so I can argue with it.
My question,
because I know my own religion better than I know Christianity.
My question has been, I don't know if the role that the state plays in Judaism and Christianity is the same, because I'm not sure what to make of what I would say is the Jews put a tremendous amount of emphasis on the state as a mechanism for salvation, something like that. That might be the symbolic idea that underlies the establishment of Israel. And I would say that in Christianity...
You mean the nation, or you mean like the government?
I mean the nation, but then it gets tangled up with the government, right? So
right. This is a distinction that Christianity is a universalistic religion, right?
Yeah.
The idea is that in the kingdom of God, everyone is Christian, basically, and Judaism is not in one sense, but it is in another, which is that God identifies a nation that he treasures as his own, and he has a special relationship with that nation. But Judaism is not exclusivist with regard to who gets into heaven. So there's this basic idea in Genesis that there are commandments that are given prior to the giving of the Torah, right? That there's what we call the Sheva Mitzvot B'nai Noach, the 7 commandments that are given to the sons of Noah, meaning all mankind. And these are things like no murder, no idolatry, no adultery. They basically mirror a lot of the 10 commandments. And so the idea in Judaism is that it's almost like a priestly caste. God chose this specific group of people to be a light unto the nations by demonstrating what a godly lifestyle looks like if you dedicate every aspect of your life to God. And then he said to everybody else, I know not everybody else is up to this, and in fact, Judaizers are supposed to try and turn away converts, but you can still get into heaven. The idea that we are trying to force anyone into being Jewish, that's not a thing. So nationalism without the conversion...
You can think about that psychologically as an attempt to both manage the preservation of group identity, so that would be culture, a cultural identity, which has some utility, and also to be able to coexist with others who are doing things in a different way.
And again, Judaism has had a long history of, just like every other religion, of sort of evolution on this stuff. Right? Like when you read the book of Joshua, there's actual forced conversion that happens in the book of Joshua. But by the time you get to early Christianity and midpoint Judaism, right, because Judaism is a lot older than Christianity, then you're already talking about Jews who are not looking to convert people. They sort of want to live in their own state. They don't want to bother anyone else for the most part. So the idea of like a tidal wave of conquering Jews going out, I mean, even to think about it now is hilarious, right? Nobody thinks about it that way, except if you're a conspiratorial nutbag. But it's
the Inquisitions usually work the other way.
That's right.
So anything that you might have heard Ben just say, would anything jive with a fundamental belief that you have that would cause a problem? You know what I mean? Like cause a problem in society.
Well, I think that one potential problem that's worth discussing, but it would take forever to discuss it, is the relative role of the individual versus the state. I mean, you see this argued out in the prophetic books in the Old Testament.
Yes.
I mean, there's the Jewish state, and it's sort of the central player in some sense, but there's clear evidence that it can become corrupt, it can fall away, and that a prophet who's an individual has to step forward and revivify it, right? And so there's tremendous emphasis on the utility of the individual. And you see that in Judaism, I would say, overall, it's a very cohesive, it promotes in-group cohesion, let's say, but it also allows for individual expression in a very interesting ways, because there's tremendous emphasis in Jewish culture on learning and articulation and mastery of ideas. And so that provides this space for the individual to flourish. With Christianity, you see more of a move away, I would say, from the idea of the state. Now, that's not necessarily without its troubles. One of the things Jung pointed out was, well, as Christianity becomes more about the individual, the religion itself tends to fragment, like it did with Protestantism, until it just fragments right to the point where every individual is their own church. And then you have no continuity and no tradition. And the Catholics were kind of a bulwark against that. But I do think that there's a discussion to be had about the relative role of the individual in redeeming the world, let's say, versus the state in redeeming the world. And I would say the Christians come down more strongly on the side of the individual, and the Jews come down more strongly on the side of the state.
Yeah.
Now, like, I'm willing to be corrected about that, because
Yeah.
I've never actually been able to have a discussion with anyone about that. So I don't know what you think about that.
I think there's some truth to that. I mean, I think the idea of, in Hebrew, Am Yisrael, like the idea of the nation of Israel being paramount. And when you pray in collective terms. You don't pray in individual terms. Everything is done in terms of anachnu, in terms of we, praying as a group, right? You're supposed to pray in a minyan.
So how do you
really
both
by
square
yourself.
that away in your own ways? How do you square that away as someone
Because
that
there's a lot
believes
of
in
play
the
in the
individual?
joints.
Yeah.
There's a lot of play in the joints, meaning that, so for example, to take the most obvious example, if you want to talk about the power of the Jewish state in sort of biblical context, there's tremendous argument between whether a kingship is a good thing or a kingship is a bad thing in the Old Testament, right? I mean, it says like Samuel warns the Jewish people, if you take a king, here's what's going to happen. It's all going to suck, right? And then they form a kingship, and things suck. And so there's a strong case to be made that kingship was not actually what was wanted, because you have an entire period of just judges, and the judges are legitimately just individuals who are trusted by the people, but then they can be supplanted at any time by another judge who's not from the lineage. So, so when we say that group identity matters in Judaism, it matters to the extent that you're following God's law. But if you stray away from that, the idea, I think Judaism has always said that what you do is what makes you part of the group, not what you are. So Judaism has a weird dichotomy in it that's largely driven by exigent circumstances, which is the idea of biological Judaism versus the idea of religious Judaism. So I care very little about biological Judaism. Like when somebody says, somebody such and such is Jewish, Noam Chomsky is Jewish, like so what? I really don't care. And I think that most Orthodox Jews, we basically biological Judaism, or your mom was Jewish, which is the way that it works in Orthodox Judaism, is sort of the entry ticket to being Jewish, meaning you have to either have converted in, or your mom has to be Jewish in order for you to become fully Jewish. But the practice is what matters to me more than anything else. And that's where you get back into grace-based versus acts-based a little bit, right?
Well, that's another place where the group identity issue becomes paramount. It's like, well, there's this group, well, how is membership defined? Well, let's say it's defined by ethnicity, something like that, which would be related to the descent through the mother. It's like, well, that's a problem. I'm not saying it's wrong. I'm saying it's a problem because it demarcates a group. You say, well, this is a group that only we can belong to.
But what's weird is you can convert in. Right? So this is why I say when there's play in the joints, a lot of the problems are solvable through the idea that you can convert in. So Judaism says you can't convert out, but then we don't punish people who leave, right? But which is different than Islam.
Yes. Yes, it's actually a relatively important difference.
That's right.
Point out.
But I mean, one of the people who I work with at my company, Andrew Clavin, is a guy who's born Jewish and now is Christian. Yeah. Right. So in my view, he's Jewish, but am I going to drag him down to my synagogue? Like, that's not a thing.
Right.
So but I think that what the group identity, the one thing I will say for group identity is that what we have seen is that if there is lack of group identity, that group identity is filled usually by nefarious groups, meaning that that people do have a necessity. The idea of existing, that you find your meaning, or you find your purpose, or you find your identity just in yourself as an individual, is not only wrong, it's belied by virtually all of human history.
Careful, you're going to make an argument for identity politics.
Right, exactly.
Well, that's why I wanted to ask this question.
I understand.
But the point but what Judaism does, what America does, it says find your identity in the ideas.
Yeah.
Right, that's the difference. This is why I say I don't care about biological Judaism, particularly. I care much more about the ideas that you hold. So I'm in favor of group identity if group identity is built around a set of ideas that are worth preserving. I'm not in favor of group identity. I am a conservative. That's a group identity.
Right.
But that's an identifier more than it's an identity, meaning it's a way of identifying me as a person who thinks this way. And because I think there are differences in modes of thought, then those group identities do matter. I mean, this is why we get together. This is why we have discussions. This is why we have friends.
Families.
Right. This is why we have families.
Yeah.
But I'm glad you said that the way you did, because I try to challenge myself on that all the time, because I talk about the individual, I believe in the individual, and I want to make sure that I'm not occasionally
But if we can find commonality,
back.
And this is what I think is one of the things that's broken down, is we used to have a common purpose. Like I have this framework that I'm working on in the book that I'm writing, where I basically say that in order for an individual to be happy, you need four things. You need individual purpose. You need individual capacity, like a feeling that you can accomplish that purpose, or at least make moves in that direction. You need a communal purpose. You do need to feel like you are part of a group that's moving in the right direction, and you need communal capacity, which both allows the community to activate together and also protects your rights as an individual to do what you want to do in pursuit of your individual purpose. And that's the apotheosis of happiness, and that's what I think the Founding Fathers were trying to do in the United States, for example, set up a framework where you could fulfill all of these things. But you do need the idea of communal purpose. And one of the things that's happened post-Enlightenment is that people don't even think in terms of, they either think purely in terms of communal purpose or not at all in terms of communal purpose. So they think either purely in terms of communal purpose, and that's identity politics, meaning I'm black, therefore the black community should do X, right? Or I'm Jewish, therefore the Jewish community should do X. And then there are people who think not in terms of communal purpose at all, meaning full-on libertarian, I make my own meaning, we don't have to have anything in common. And that's a lie. Even libertarians believe we have to have an idea of liberty in common. Right,
and they have to live with other people.
Right, exactly.
Yeah, harmoniously.
And when we don't have any sort of communal purpose, when we live with a bunch of people with whom we share nothing, then it falls apart incredibly quickly.
Okay, so here's how the Christian drama looks to me. It addresses this issue, right? So Christ is presented as a figure who's an absolute master of his tradition, right? He's debating with the Jewish elders when he's 12. So think about it psychologically. Is first you're a child and you're dependent on your parents, and then you have to make the move from being a child dependent into the world. But you don't move from child to individual. You move from child to group. That's your teenage gang. That's your adolescence. You have to catalyze your group identity. If you don't have a group identity, it's actually a developmental failure, right? But then you might think, well, wait a second. Group identity is necessary, but is it the highest? Does it represent the highest plane of moral achievement? The answer to that is no. You have to emerge from your group as an individual. Okay, so now this is how I read the Christian story symbolically, and this is a consequence mostly of having studied Jung. He said, look, you need group identity. That's the persona that you wear. You have to have a persona. You have to be able to wear a suit. You have to simplify yourself for other people. You have to be able to play the game. Right. Otherwise, you just have failed developmentally. But if you're only a persona, then that's a big problem, partly because when the group goes insane, so do you. Okay, now you got to emerge out of the group. Okay, so now you need a symbol for what emerges out of the group. Okay, so Christ is the symbol of what should emerge out of the group, speaking psychologically. Bear the tragedy of life, speak the truth, be willing to transform through death. That's the rules. Now, I'm speaking purely psychologically. You learn something new. You learn it. It makes you suffer. The part of you that's wrong has to die. You have to let go of that. And it's hard, especially maybe you learn something profound. It's like you have to regrow an arm. It's really painful, you know. But you identify with the part of yourself that transforms through voluntary acceptance of suffering. And that's what Christ represents as a symbol. And I think that that's correct symbolically. This is what actually severed the relationship between Jung and Freud, by the way, because Jung laid out his understanding of Christianity in those terms. And Freud, it wasn't a Jewish Christian thing, though, because Freud was really, he was Jewish by ethnicity, but not by practice. No, not at all. He just didn't want to have anything to do with religious ideation at all. He thought that would introduce, he called it like a black tidal wave of occultism back into what he regarded as a science. He had his point. But I think Jung got the symbolic structure right. And so what does that mean in relationship to Christianity and Judaism? Well, it's really complicated because you have the prophetic tradition in Judaism, and the prophets are also symbols of people who emerge from the pathological group, who step forward courageously, and who reconstitute the group.
Yeah. So you believe these people could exist right now?
Which people?
The prophets.
I think prophets of sorts exist always.
Yeah.
I think Dostoevsky was a prophet. Nietzsche was clearly a prophet. I mean, he predicted what was going to happen in the 20th century. Yeah. Can you imagine predicting what's going to happen in the 21st century?
Well, the reason I asked it like that was because I think when you say prophets, I think people think of like someone coming down from heaven and they're going to have a halo on or some crazy thing. But you think that's why I was trying to get to the realism.
I agree. I actually fully agree with this. In fact, so does Maimonides. I mean, Maimonides has an entire section in Guide for the Perplexed about prophecy. And what he says is there's Moses level level prophecy, which is the legislating prophet, which is, and he says he's the only legislating prophet in the Jewish view. But all the other prophets are just people who see things incredibly clearly, essentially. They're people who've studied philosophy and who have studied human morality and have studied the human being. And then that's
they're way down on the iceberg.
That's right.
That's the thing that makes them different.
Exactly. And so in that sense, people who predicting the thing about, providing a certain level of stability for folks, and we're, I think there are levels of prophecy is what I'll say. And I think that the better you are at recognizing human behavior and the interplay of forces, the better you are at saying, okay, here's what's going to happen next week. I think it's very difficult for anybody to say, here's what's going to happen in 100 years, because if you could predict that, you'd make a lot in the stock market. But I think that you could